we didn't intend to use it the way we did. You have to understand that. Well, truth be told, we didn't even intend to invent it in the first place. It used to be considered impossible to travel in time, except in movies and the like. People had tried to, obviously, but none of them had even the faintest idea of where to start. How do you solve a problem when you're not really sure what the problem is in the first place? I don't remember the full details of how it happened, but suddenly it got announced on the news that some young scientist in Tokyo or Hong Kong or somewhere like that had finally cracked it. Cracked it by accident, apparently. And that the rights to the technology had been snapped up by that one really rich man, the one with the plane company and the car company and the rocket company and the train company. You know, that one? Of course, it was mostly academics and historians who forked over the money at first. The average Joe was still perfectly content with their fortnight in Majorca. I mean, currency exchange from pounds to euros was already a nightmare. Imagine exchanging them to tuppence and shillings. So, the cruises started, the historians poked their heads around the proverbial curtain and... oh, wow. I mean, you wouldn't believe the stuff we found. Whole new historical heroes we'd completely forgotten about, treasures saved from extinction, new insights on how people used to live and work and play. It was fascinating. Or at least I thought so. My co-workers at the office didn't seem so bothered. For a while, it looked like that's all it was going to be. Just a few boffins popping back and forth to correct the books, but, well, naturally that wasn't enough for the cruise company. You've got to expand, haven't you? Can't keep running things at an equilibrium. So the prices began to drop and the ad men got working, and soon the first truly public time ships were setting sail into history. I remember the adverts. It was an escape from the chaos of the world, they said. A chance to get away from all the uncertainty of the present and retreat back into a time where life was simple and easy. You could lounge around on the beaches, sipping margaritas, in the 100% certainty that you absolutely won't be blown up in a nuclear war, or caught in a terrorist attack, or baked to death by climate change. And not only that, but you could do it all in the style and manner of your favourite period of history. For the first time ever, people could completely leave their own world behind. Leave themselves behind. I was on one of those early cruises. It was tiny by the standards of what came later. A weekend excursion into the 1920s. We were asked to dress properly for the time period in order to make sure we weren't found out, and clearly some of them had been watching a few too many old movies. They were there, dressed in garish coloured pinstriped suits and ornate flapper outfits, only to find themselves in a sea of pedestrians dressed in plain shirts and average dresses. I mean, do they really think that the whole decade looked like the Great Gatsby? Should have taken the hint. Maybe asked some questions about the whole venture, but no, of course they didn't. The second problem was that the past just couldn't live up to people's standards. When they thought about going back in time, they imagined partying at Woodstock with all the hippies, stealing armour from a medieval knight, drinking champagne with Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra, but that just wasn't reality. Most of history was just, well, normal. Once you got over the initial thrill of stepping into a whole new time period, you quickly discovered that it really wasn't that different from the present you left behind. It was just people going about their lives, working, eating, sleeping, maybe reading a book every now and then. That was it. The only real difference was that the past didn't seem so fussy about cleanliness. I remember seeing a woman selling eels in the street. They were alive, yes, actually alive, and wriggling on the stand. I paid her a couple of shillings and she picked one up, slit it open, took out the guts, and wrapped the whole thing in newspaper. I must admit I quite enjoyed it, actually. It felt real, like I'd stumbled across a more intimate part of the past, a little piece that no one ever wrote about but that I now had the privilege of being privy to. That was the real allure for me. But, my fellow tourists didn't seem to agree. "This is supposed to be a luxury cruise," one woman complained. "Why are we being forced to eat this disgusting muck?" The next generation of ships had a buffet on board. No one went back to the street vendors after that. What were they expecting? That's what I kept wondering. Was I the only one with realistic expectations? I mean, did no one stop to think, for example, that flushing indoor toilets weren't common until the mid-1950s? Surely I wasn't the only one who had done their research on leaded petrol, smog, urine hair dye and gong farmers. The past was a foreign country. They had their own way of doing things. It wasn't going to be like the pageants or the reenactments, no matter how accurate they'd been. And with every new complaint, the companies added more and more conveniences, more and more ways to forget where we actually were. And that's where it really started to go wrong. I first became aware of the issue while on a tour around the medieval era. The guide was pointing out this big stone monastery in the distance, still in the process of being built, and explaining why it would become so important several hundred years later. And then this guy next to me just casually got out his phone and took a picture. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, he began rummaging around in his bag before pulling out a packet of crisps, scoffing the lot in one horrific gulp and then throwing the disused bag onto the ground. Thankfully, I was there to pick it up and carry it to the ship's waste disposal, but clearly that man wasn't an outlier because headlines started cropping up all over the place. Coke can dug up in the ruins of ancient Pompeii, that sort of thing. And so, naturally, some people tried to pass some legislation about it, but their effectiveness was really rather limited. There was no possibility of stopping the cruises. They were making far too much money for that. And their numbers were increasing so much every day that tracking every piece of potential litter was next door to impossible. It wasn't long then until the people of the past began to catch on to us. 1862 was the first year to make contact. They gathered a small militia to track the string of rubbish, cornered the tour guides and demanded to know who they were. I don't quite remember what happened next. It was all a bit hush-hush on the news for a while, but the next thing we knew, Abraham Lincoln was shaking hands with his current-day counterpart. I can still remember the president's face at that moment. He must have thought the angels had smiled on him personally that day. I don't think he washed his hand for a week afterwards. The result of their meeting was never published, but, well, there must have been a lot of trade agreements on the syllabus, because when I next took a trip to 1860s America, the ship docked right outside an authentic Western gift shop. It had to be the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. Built in and of the time, but accepting modern-day currency and selling, well, just stuff. Whatever they thought would sell. There were handkerchiefs, paperweights, little wooden horses, all stuff that would be considered cheap tat in any other circumstance, but because they were made in 1862, people were paying through the nose for them. There were places like that littered all throughout the Wild West. My fellow tourists couldn't get enough of them. It was the serving staff they most enjoyed. All faux cowboys dressed in sequins and brightly coloured tassels, all speaking with the most ludicrously over-the-top accents. It was worse than even the cheapest of pageants had been. I remember ordering a root beer from a bar, and when the server brought it over, she made some comment about how there's nothing like a good old root beer to get y'all ready for a bit of the old cattle rustling. Yee-haw! I asked her if she normally spoke like that, and the look she gave me was one I'd only ever seen before in a mall Santa when one of the kids tugged on their beard. "Well, sure we do, son," she said. "That's just what life is like out on the old open range." I raised my eyebrow and finally she broke the act. "Listen, it's what people want, okay?" I asked if she felt insulted at all and she just laughed. "I'm only as offended as my next paycheck allows." And then she was off. The whole thing felt tainted after that. Like returning to your old childhood home only to find the new owners have added an extension. It was wrong. It's okay, I don't expect you to understand. And then, of course, you couldn't have people discovering us time travellers in 1862 and then forgetting about it the year after. So now places like that authentic Western gift shop were springing up all over the place. All these different time zones competing to get the attention of the tourists, leaning into whatever stereotypes we used to have about them. There was this hotel built in the 1980s, Bright neon everywhere, synth music blaring in every speaker, servers dressed as Michael Jackson and Ronald Reagan. It was always packed, but never by the people from that time. No, always by tourists. That hotel's still around now. It never existed before all this got started, but now it's retroactively one of the longest lasting and biggest chains of hotels in the world, always updating to whatever the fashion of the day is. Other time zones had to work harder for their money. 1940s Europe was practically a no-go zone for ages. That was until the powers that were decided to start scheduling the war around their off-peak season. Pretty soon the Blitz just became another attraction, most of the bombs being replaced with fireworks. Hitler wasn't even in power anymore. A few of his underlings had seized the opportunity and sent him to our time to be tried for all the crimes he was going to commit. In the place of his precious Third Reich, a small attraction called Nazi Corner was constructed in Berlin, where children could have photographs taken with mascots dressed as stormtroopers and, yes, even Hitler himself. The big bad villain that pantomime audiences got to boo at on the weekend matinees. People began to protest back home, of course they did. There were the endless debates about historical erosion and loss of cultural identity, but what could be done about it? Even if we had all packed up and left, the people of those times would still remember. Some of those people were still alive in our time, their heads all muddled with multiple versions of their memories all swimming around at once. Yes, we knew perfectly well that we'd screwed up in a pretty major way, but what were we going to do about it? It wasn't like we could check the history books to give us clues about what the so-called real history had been. They'd all been reduced to smudges on paper, the words constantly flickering and changing, pages appearing and disappearing at the blink of an eye. And besides, the travel industry was thriving, and it wouldn't be long until the others followed suit. The first Starbucks appeared in 16th century LA, around the same time as the motorways began to roll out across Celtic Britain. Well, the Romans liked it so much they copied the design. It wasn't enough now that the past had become a parody of itself. People were now demanding the exact same sort of conveniences as the world they'd left behind. Gone were the thatched roofs of Shakespeare's London. Now the peasantry were living in semi-detached houses and concrete high-rises. And it always looked a bit wrong to see Paris before the Eiffel Tower, or London before Big Ben. So while we were at it, we built those a bit further back too. It made city planning next to impossible. One night you'd wake up to discover your house was now, and always had been, a McDonald's, and that your new house was some massive tower block that hadn't even existed the night before, but which the history books, when they were working properly, swore blind had always been there. Don't even get me started on the debate about whether it was even worth building the Twin Towers anymore. And all these new places, all these new flats with their sanitation and flushing toilets and central heating, all the new hospitals and highways and restaurants, they began to have even greater effects. Whole new swathes of people who had been destined to die of plague or war or famine, those who weren't supposed to grow up, those who were never meant to be born in the first place, their children, their grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren. The world's population sprung from 8 billion to 8 trillion in a matter of seconds. There was crowding, confusion and chaos, and we realised that we had to stop. Really, truly stop. All journeys into the past were frozen. All deals severed. All progress halted. For a few years, that's how we lived. Waiting as the governments of the world convened and tried to find a way to make history work again. The solution they arrived at seemed so simple. One more journey would be arranged. A trip far back before human beings even evolved, further back than anyone had ever gone before. And from that vantage point, a monument would be built. It would be a temple, a new Garden of Eden, in which the apes that would eventually become humans would be raised and cultivated. The Shrine of Continuity, it was called. And in that shrine, the human race would be told exactly where and how to build every structure in the world. Every road, every house, every skyscraper, every car park, nothing would be left to chance. Human history would effectively cease to exist, replaced with one eternal present where nothing new could ever be allowed to be built. The plans were drawn, the journey prepared, and when we all woke up the following morning, we awoke to find ourselves in The great eternal metropolis. The past was gone, the present was eternal, and the future had been cancelled. It was a truly strange thing to live in that time. When I was a boy, the Shard had only seen about a decade, but now it was eternal, creaking and bulking under the millions of centuries that had been heaped onto it. The air felt thicker, the ground heavier. Governments were now completely sealed away from the public eye. No more elections, no more press conferences. They were too busy tracing bloodlines in the various districts to make sure that people didn't accidentally marry their own future children. Slowly but surely our memories began to reset. All the chaos of the previous years was now becoming a distant dream. This new present was the only thing that mattered. And for a time, we really thought we'd gotten away with it. In retrospect, I suppose we really should have seen it coming. But hindsight is a fine thing, and a skill that we hadn't been able to use in a very long time. No one had thought, you see, that we'd essentially made our entire world one big bootstrap paradox. The world was made the way it was because we'd gone back in time and raised the cavemen to build it that way, but the original designers of those buildings now had nothing to do with it. So who came up with them? Who designed the Empire State Building? When? How? We'd completely robbed the world of context, and without context, a thing simply cannot exist. The decay was quick to follow. It started out small, just the occasional word on the street. "Ooh, isn't that house getting a bit see-through these days? Funny, the words in this book are starting to blur." Within a week, the rumours had been confirmed. While we'd hoped to make our time a closed loop, it was actually a downward spiral. Each new day without context caused the world to degrade a little more, like an overused cassette tape. Slowly but surely it all began to vanish. People, places, things. One by one they winked out of existence, usually after a long process of dissolving, shedding their features and their structure. The streets became empty, the petrol in the cars refused to burn, buildings unmade themselves, their windows melting or turning back to sand. People would wander aimlessly, grieving the loss of their memories and their identities before they themselves ceased to exist. Not even sounds worked the way they used to, echoes refusing to bounce back, rather landing with a dull thud and stopping in their tracks. The last news story I saw was an interview from a particularly worried scientist who mentioned how even subatomic particles weren't behaving as they should anymore, being both particles and waves at the same time, no matter how much they were observed. The interviewer asked them what could be done about it, but TV, radio and Wi-Fi signals stopped functioning before he could answer. Then came the pockets of almost time. All those pasts and futures we thought had been erased, they all began to appear like stains from behind peeling wallpaper. A medieval barn spilling briefly from the faded form of a high-rise flat, the hanging gardens of Babylon suddenly reappearing in a flourish of green before evaporating into mist. I even saw the ghost of a flying car zoom over my head. It was their last hurrah. A final bow before the falling curtain wiped them out for good. We tried to fix it, but none of the ideas that were floated felt practical. Go back and destroy the Shrine of Continuity? That would just put us back to where we were before. Stop the creation of time travel? Paradox. How could we destroy time travel if we had to use time travel to do it? Some suggested that we attempt to restage history from scratch, doing our best to put things back exactly where they were before any of this started. But how would you even begin to go about that process, especially when all the records were gone? No, it became clear to everyone involved there was no way to stop this thing. No way to hold back the storm that was sweeping up all of history in its path. Our only hope left was that maybe, if we got a few people on board a time ship, it would shield them. Maybe then the storm would pass eventually. Maybe those people could climb out when it was all over and start civilization afresh. A whole new history free from the failings of the past, and, well, that's rather where we fit in. Well, there you are, son. I'm sorry you had to sit there listening to me rabbiting on all the time. Just a chance for me to relive the past while there's still a little bit of it left. It's ironic in a way. We're using the time ships now for the exact reason we built them in the first place. Running away. I don't suppose it'll work. We do have a nasty habit of bringing all our baggage along with us, and that storm outside has only gotten larger these last few years. Still, maybe it won't always be like that, eh? Maybe you'll be the one to work it all out. They do say the young generation always has to clear up the mess left by the last lot. Although, I suppose the term generations doesn't have the same meaning anymore, since time doesn't exactly...
As